anytime somebody is looking at well-being, and sometimes they're looking at health and sometimes they're looking at straight up happiness, it doesn't matter really. Our happiness and our overall well-being is best predicted consistently by both the breadth and the depth of our real life social connections.
Hello and welcome to the Sunshine Parenting Podcast, where each week we talk about ideas for raising kids who become thriving adults. I'm your host, Audrey Monkey. Here on the podcast, I share my experiences raising 5 kids who currently range in age from 16 to 26 and working with thousands more as a summer camp director over the past 3 decades. I'm the author of Happy Campers, and I frequently do workshops with parents, teachers, and summer camp professionals about social skills, connection, and happiness, topics I researched extensively for my master's in psychology. If you want tools for raising kind, optimistic, self-reliant kids who become thriving adults, you've come to the right place. Hey, Sunshine Parenting listeners, I am thrilled to bring you this week's episode, which is an interview with Dr. Christine Carter, who remains one of my favorite parenting and happiness experts. Christine received her Ph.D. in sociology at UC Berkeley and was recruited to lead the Greater Good Science Center as the executive director. Later, she hired a new executive director so that she could pursue her writing and speaking career full-time. I first learned about Christine from her 2010 book, Raising Happiness: 10 Simple Steps for More Joyful Kids and Happier Parents. It still remains to this day one of my favorites. Dr. Christine Carter loves to share her work in person. She is an engaging and sought-after speaker who combines scientific research and practical application. She offers audiences not only a way to cope with modern pressures, but tactics to truly thrive. In this episode, we're talking about Christine's brand new book, The New Adolescence: Raising Happy and Successful Teens in an Age of Anxiety and Distraction. Our interview runs a little bit longer than my usual ones, but we had a lot to talk about. So I hope you enjoy this episode 127 with Dr. Christine Carter. Today on the podcast, I am so excited to have my original episode 1 podcast guest back on. Welcome back, Christine.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here too.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited to talk to you and also just to share with the world your brand new book, which is The New Adolescence: Raising Happy and Successful Teens in an Age of Anxiety and Distractions. So thanks for being back with me. Why don't we start by just talking about, well, first of all, I didn't even say your whole name. Why don't you introduce yourself and just say briefly a little bit about your background for listeners who don't already know you?
My name is Christine Carter, and I'm a sociologist and an author of parenting books, a coach. I've, for many years, worked out of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley.
And we got connected because of your first book, Raising Happiness, because I loved it so much that I had to send it to all of our camp parents back in whatever year that was, 2011, I think, or 12 or something. And then you did a webinar for our parents. And then since then, you became a camp parent yourself. Both of your daughters grew up at camp, and then you've been doing trainings for us too. So we've gotten to be friends through this process of all the things that you're sharing that I love so much.
Well, it's been really a fun friendship for me as well.
So this book, which I'm so excited I got to get an early copy so that I could read it before it comes out to the world, is really, really good. And it's interesting how it's kind of followed your path where you wrote Raising Happiness when your girls were little. Uh-huh. And now you've written one that's suited to the age they are now. So why don't you talk a little bit more about why you wrote this book?
Well, honestly, I was going to wait to write it until my kids were kind of all grown up and had cleared adolescence successfully. But then I started looking at the data, right? I saw the research related to what's happening to teenagers today. So kind of 2 things happened. One was that I just started seeing all this really interesting and concerning information coming out about mental illness in our teenagers today. And the other thing was that I just seemed to have a lot of friends whose kids were struggling. In fact, like virtually everyone I know had one or more kids that was really having some very real difficulties with anxiety or with depression. And in fact, one of our closest family friends who was a super high achieving kid on a really like very seemingly secure trajectory. And she sort of revealed to me that she was suicidal, and and she's okay now, but, and she didn't, thank God she didn't hurt herself. But it was a big wake up call for me. I thought, you know what? Everything is different for these kids, and we actually really understand why. And that's really good news, right? We understand what is happening to these kids, but we just need to take up our parenting game, right? And I don't mean that we're slacking off or not doing a good job. What I do mean is that as parents, for the most part, we haven't adapted to the massive changes, and we're not like continuing to adapt as things continue to change, right? So that's a very long-winded way of saying I wrote this book so that I could take my own parenting game up. You know, when I wrote Raising Happiness, I had 2 little kids, and as that was being published, I remarried and have 2 stepkids as well. And so, you know, raising 4 teenagers has made me very, very aware of my own shortcomings, right? As a parent, and like where I just needed more information.
Oh my gosh.
So we have a lot of information. Right.
Yeah, I love it. And I think the way you write it is very encouraging, because it's reality. Like, okay, here's what's going on, but it's also encouragement of here's a few things you can do to kind of address these new issues. So I think when you talked about your family friend, you're talking about, is it her name? I mean, you call her Sarah.
Sarah. Yeah.
Okay. Is that her real name?
It is her real name. Originally, I wrote it with a pen name, and she asked me to use her real name because it's her story, and she feels like she's going to use her story to help the world, right? She didn't want to be disassociated with it, which I think is wonderful.
Well, and I really like that you chose her, because I think a lot of what parents are trying to do, which they think is for the best for their kids, is resulting in kids like Syra.
Yeah.
Syra, who on the outside appear to be doing great, but there are a lot of internal struggles that at some point come to a head and leave them really in a bad state of mind. So there's a couple things that I want to talk about with you. One is, I really like when you talk about the concept of, as your kids get into adolescence, changing your mindset from being their manager to being their coach. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the best way to think about this is, everybody says, oh, well, you're going to have to sort of back off of your teenagers a little bit, right? And it's true. They need a lot less practical support than they do when they're little, of course, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they need less emotional support. And so the idea of going from being their sort of chief of staff or their manager, right? Like just getting everything together, making sure they have what they need to where they're going, getting to their things on time, all of that kind of stuff. They really need to start doing all of that for themselves, or they don't do very well in the world, right? And this is a hard habit for us as parents to break, I think. Right? If we're used to doing everything for our kids, and we find meaning and a sense of purpose in being somebody's chief of staff, basically, or manager, then it's hard. It's a loss for us of a role. What you do get is you gain this role as a coach. And by coach, I do not mean like the obnoxious coach yelling from the sidelines. That is not what I mean. I mean like a life coach, right? Like somebody to ask a lot of questions to help them clarify what it is they want, right? Teenagers especially, are really good at telling us what they don't want, right? They need coaches to ask them to clarify, well, we get what you don't want. what is it that you do want, right? What outcomes are you after? How will you get those outcomes, right? So you can be as emotionally supportive as you want, but not over involved, right? Like just always resorting back to being somebody who's asking a lot of questions, helping them clarify for themselves what it is that they're after.
Oh, I just love that
So
so
hard.
much. Yeah,
It's so hard because
yes.
we know what we want for them, right? It's very clear to me what outcomes I want for my kids. So this role to like this shift to being a coach, like as a coach, I never tell people like what they should want. I never say you should want X, Y, or Z, because that is not a helpful coaching, right? Like people have to arrive at it themselves.
Right.
And so once you get the hang of it, it's more gratifying than it sounds.
I loved how you gave the example of how, as a step parent, you really, you take a role that's a little different. And I think of that the same way as like when I am counseling like adolescents or young adults at camp, the way I treat them and talk to them, really when I translate it to my own children needs to be more similar than what you tend to do because of the old patterns that you stay in with your own kids. And I think it's really true that this whole concept needs to be internalized by parents. And in Raising Happiness, you talk a lot about the oxygen, putting your own oxygen mask on first.
Yeah.
And in the New Adolescence, you talk about just showing them kind of a thriving adult, like showing them the way as opposed to kind of prescribing for them, you need to do it this way. Also, you mentioned, which I really like, just that whole thing about not getting so caught up in like their things reflecting your success, like your, and I think I love that you wrote the book and you were brave enough to put it out there because your adolescence, just like mine and just like everybody else's, will not be perfect.
I know. It's
nobody is.
It's
and we aren't either. And our kids will have setbacks and make mistakes and sometimes get themselves into bad circumstances. And these things are going to happen. And it doesn't matter that you have your PhD and you know all about this stuff.
Right. I know. We can only do our best, right? We can only do our best, right? And so, but I feel like there's a significant, probably nobody listening to this podcast actually, but there is a portion of parents, we all know them, that, it's the old, you can't fail if you don't really try, right? It's daunting. This teenager thing is daunting. And it's gotten a lot harder in the sense that like, our parents felt like they had to explain to us the basic birds and the bees, for example, right? Well, that was like back when gender was binary and like there was no internet porn, there was not early exposure to porn, and there was no Tinder, and do you know what I mean? Like it was complex then and uncomfortable then, but now it's like, wow, my husband, who's older than me a lot, and I shouldn't say a lot, but
I'm sure he'll love that description.
He would hate that, right? So he's 14 years older than I am, which puts him in like kind of a different generation. And he is really having a hard time just basically grasping the concepts of like what does it mean to be queer, right? Like this is so I understand why parents are not engaging in some of these harder issues because it's hard to even understand what's going on.
Right.
I had to write about it a lot and do a lot of research and talk to a lot of people before I'm like, okay, I got this thing.
Right.
You guys, we're going to have a conversation about sex, or we're going to have several of them. And guess what? I am not any more comfortable. Right. Like, it's still, I'm super tense and like,
can we recruit you to come in to talk to all the rest of our kids?
I actually have an easier time talking to my friends' kids than my own. And because you want them to like talk to you, but then it's really a shocking thing when they do, right? Like when they're like telling you about stuff, I'm like, oh my God, I am your mother. Like, why are you telling me this? Right? Like, so it's hard, right? Like it's hard to sort of find the right role and want them to have their own privacy and still like weigh in on like,
right.
no, I feel really strongly about this and I have a lot more experience than you and I'm not going to use shoulds, but like, let's just, anyway,
Right.
it's pretty daunting.
I know.
The whole situation right now.
It is, but your book is a great guidebook, and it's a great start for people who are struggling. And I do think I have seen also, my sister commented once that she felt like in her community, the parents of teenagers are just like, oh, they're just like on their own. And they were just letting them do whatever they wanted. And it was just this laissez-faire. And even parents who had been really like super like, over managing when they were little, some of them went too far the other way. So there's just this balance that I think sometimes parents have a hard time finding between letting your child grow up, gain more responsibility, more independence, trusting them, doing this, changing your relationship. But I really think it's great. I love this. I think it's very simple to think about that. Changing from being a manager to a coach. You're there for advice. You want them to come to you when they're struggling with something or need some help, but you are not going to tell them how to, you're not going to make their dentist appointment anymore.
Yeah, totally.
You're going to share with them the phone number and make sure they know how often you need to go and that kind of thing. It's those kinds of ideas that are really helpful, I think, for parents making this transition. Okay, so let's get into, I really liked the 3 core skills for the digital age that you chose to focus on. So I'd love for you to just talk about briefly why you picked those 3 and why you think they're so important for adolescents and young adults today.
Okay, well, so the 3 core skills are focus, connection, and by that I mean face-to-face connection with real live people, and rest. And so I picked them all for different reasons. Focus is obviously like we are living through an age of great distraction. And at the same time, we're seeing a real changeover in the type of work that these kids are going to be asked to do. Most of them will be paid to think. And especially those who are well-educated will get jobs which basically require focus. At the same time, they're not developing focus as a skill because they're multitasking all the time. They're constantly interrupted. They never learn to value focus. They never learn to, a lot of these kids are not learning, they don't have the experience of doing deep work. And when you don't even know what you're going for, it's an issue, right? So that's why there are lots of people out there saying focus is the superpower of the 21st century. This is like the most important thing that they need for their success. I would also say that for their happiness because we know that the sort of deep gratification and fulfillment that comes from being able to persist in your long-term goals, right? And that takes focus, right? Building mastery takes focus. The things that are really gratifying to us take focus. So and that's different than focusing for hours on end on a video game, right? But kids don't know that, right? So that's why I picked focus, connection. I'm going to say this. I probably said this like 20 times on all of your podcasts and everything else. Like that is the most important predictor of happiness that we have. And this is the most consistent finding that we have in the last 100 or so years of research in many different disciplines. Anytime somebody is looking at well-being, and sometimes they're looking at health and sometimes they're looking at straight up happiness, it doesn't matter really. Our happiness and our overall well-being is best predicted consistently by both the breadth and the depth of our real life social connections. And this is a generation that is less connected, ironically, right, than previous generations. They spend less time with their friends. Now, of course, they're connected online, but the human nervous system evolved to be connected in person, right? So we get a lot out of touch, even just like tiny little like micro touches, like somebody patting your shoulder barely, right? And we get a ton out of eye contact. Our nervous system doesn't feel alone when it can make eye contact with somebody else. And when your nervous system feels like it's alone, as it does when you're just like alone in your room, but connecting with people over text or social media or whatever, it feels stressed.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot else going on there,
Right.
but a lot of the things that like the problems with social media and all this like social comparison, we can talk a little bit more about that later if we have time, but real life social connections are a really good antidote.
Yeah, I'm well, of course, you're preaching to the choir here. That like chapter 1 of my book is connection comes first, because if parents only do one thing, it's that fostering the relationship with their kids and then helping their kids foster those close face-to-face relationships, which of course happen at camp and are the reason that now kids view summer camp as this like Mecca special oasis, because it's for some of them the only place where they get uninterrupted face-to-face time to be with people.
Yeah, I know. I mean, think about how dramatic it is from the time you went to camp at Gold Arrow to now, right? Do you know what I mean? Because that used to be the norm for all of human history. That was the norm. Life was much more like it was at camp, like, you know, from face-to-face and the social connections. And now it's the 2 or 3 weeks that they have in their entire year. That's all they get. So anyway, connection is really important. And it's been an interesting transition for me, because once I realized that I really needed to encourage my kids to spend more time with their friends, I ended up spending more time driving, and buying more junk food, right? I'm a total health food nut. And so like these small little things, I realized that my stepson would basically only have his friends over if there was tons of junk food in the house. I did not realize this. My sister-in-law said, you have a problem. There is nothing to eat in this house. This is why the boys like come through, open the fridge, and then keep going. Like you have a bad reputation. Anyway, so she came with like 2 full bags of junk food, and that solved the problem. So I had to really sort of back down on one, like what to me was a moral principle, right? Because this is the most important thing, like spending time with your friends. I like it when they're here with me, you know, so even if that we give them privacy, but
right. Oh, I love that. Okay. So finish with your third important thing.
And
by the way, before you even continue, all 3 of these things are equally important for us as parents or as adults.
Oh yeah, totally.
Like I'm looking 100%. I mean, it's all the same.
Yeah. Yes. So. Like if all you do is start modeling this stuff better, like if that's the only thing you do, like, cause parents, like the connection thing is really interesting. All the adults that I work with are constantly complaining how they don't have time for friends. Right. And it's like, well, you got to make time, right? Like this is like the most important thing for your happiness, right? For you too. Like, anyway, so the third thing is rest. And these kids, okay, well, so when you look at the like sort of tsunami of mental illness that is coming towards us, in terms of super high anxiety, depression, suicidality, really, really scary. It is explainable alone from a data standpoint, just by sleep deprivation, right? Like when you control for sleep, all the problems start to go away. And so obviously there's more than just sleep that is happening here. And sleep is kind of probably like a mediating factor, right? Like stuff is happening with technology and social media, for example, and it's keeping them up late at night, right? Like there's lots of things that are keeping them up, but these kids are the most underslept teenagers we've ever seen. And it's really affecting their mental health. And they're all under the impression that they need to stay up late. They're not all under the impression, but a lot of them are under the impression that it's okay to stay up late, and that it's more important to study than it is to sleep, and that they're too busy to take breaks. The adults I work with are always giving each other like I do these workshops, and like in the beginning, they're giving each other tips about like, oh, don't drink water during the day because then you don't have to go to the bathroom. Like they don't take any breaks, right? They're so busy. And this is like our culture believes in busyness. It's like busyness is a sign of your value, of your productivity, of your importance. And of course, like none of that's true. It's a completely limiting belief. But this is how we operate. And our kids have picked up on this and they don't rest. And this really impairs their brain development. And they like just taking breaks changes the way you learn, right? Mm-hmm. For the better. Mm-hmm. Just taking breaks changes the way you develop skills, the physical skills, right? Mental skills, of course, too. So in any case, it's not just sleep. Sleep is the most important thing, especially if you've got a kid who's anxious. But it's also taking breaks during the day, like really considerable ones.
Yeah. Well, I think you really, in your last book, The Sweet Spot, that really hit me. And it was very memorable, that whole idea. And I have totally changed my perspective since reading that, because I used to feel like I wanted to make sure people knew that I was like always working so hard and I was always doing everything and staying up late to get things done. And it wasn't that I wanted people to think I was busy. It was more like that I wanted them to think I was competent and like getting things done. And it really, like reading your book, I was like, wait, this is not, I actually am better at what I do if I do take breaks, if I get a good night's sleep, if I have plenty of time to read, if I have lots of time with my friends. I'm better at everything else. Those rest breaks make me better, So, and I think you're so right that it's so much harder for our kids to learn this stuff when adults aren't even modeling it. Like even just the tech thing, people are always talking about the problem with teens, but you look around our world, it's the adults that are showing them. Don't talk to people in line at Starbucks to stare at your phone. I mean, everywhere you go, like kids are not being it's not being modeled to them.
Right.
So I think it's a big picture thing. And I do think, and I believe I remember you addressing this part too. It's not that the screens are bad. There's lots of fun things that happen in connection. We're connecting now over technology. There's like good stuff that happens. Mm-hmm. It's what it's replaced when kids are on them all the time. If our kids are only connecting with their friends online, they're not eating junk food together at your house, like, and it's what's missing is the thing that is replaced. If they're online or doing, social media late at night, they're not sleeping. So it's sort of like this also, like the way their lives are being, designed or what they're doing, the time spent is getting out of whack.
Right. Absolutely. And the technology enables them to sort of delay making plans while they watch for what like more exciting plans to happen, and the whole so they really are spending so much, an hour a day less on average time with their peers versus previous generations.
Which is so sad, because that's like the best part of adolescence. We were talking before we started recording about our high school and our high school friends, and just how those are those formative years where your relationships can get so close. And so it's such a great time, but here they are, the loneliest generation.
I know.
Of all of them right now. So, I think that's why people also like being camp counselors, because they're still basically what do you consider the new adolescence when you think of kind of ages?
Yeah, it's a very long decade, because the brain changes start about 3 years before they hit like sort of outward signs of puberty, right? So that's like 10 for most girls anyway, right? And then the brain continues, so long as you don't get pregnant or like do something that really disrupts your brain development. It's 26 or 27. So for boys, and a little bit, 26 or 27, 24 to 25 for girls, right? That's I always say teenagers. We are not talking about teenagers. We are talking about middle schoolers and high schoolers and college students, and even like the early 20 something or mid 20s, right? Your brain is still changing at a super high rate. Right. So that's how we're defining adolescence. I'm not talking about it sociologically, like that's like a whole different topic that's kind of less interesting, but like the brain changes that are happening during adolescence create speed and skill, basically. Your brain is basically just pruning out lots of neurons and insulating other ones. So it's a really important time from a brain development. The friendships that you make, right, you will have with you forever. This is why we all remember like the music that we were like, because it's something that's tied, it's so connected in your brain to that, like no other long decade.
Right. Yeah. Well, like my husband and I are great at like 80s music,
Yes. I know.
80s songs, come on, we know all the words, but like anything new, can't remember. But I remember hearing that before, that plasticity of the brain. Okay, so I just want to cover briefly, people really need to pick up your book to get kind of the detail, including really specific questions you can ask to bring up some of these difficult topics. But the end of your book, you cover talking points about some of these topics that parents just kind of really get nervous about talking about, like sex, drinking and drugs, and money. And you give some great guidance, as well as kind of explaining some of maybe the differences from when these parents were adolescents, and to just be aware of, because sometimes parents fall into the trap of thinking things are the same. I remember there was a time when, and this was quite a long time ago at camp, even pre-social media and stuff, but there was a kid who came to camp wearing a t-shirt of a band that had, the kid's behavior outwardly was pretty kind of negative, let's say. And then his t-shirt was of a band that we did a little like, what was this band talking about? And, the band was, talking about rape and violence and all this kind of whatever. So I remember calling the parent, and the parent was like, oh, I listened to, Black Sabbath and da-da-da-da-da. It's no different. And I think we are doing our kids and ourselves a disservice if we start thinking that nothing's different. You mentioned earlier, everything, it is all different. The access to pornography online, the sex without any commitment or romance, all of these things that are going on are different. So it's like a different conversations now. But I just want to, people need to read the book to get all your great info. But I want to talk about one of them, which was, you talk a lot about the drinking and drugs and just in our culture, what's going on. And there's a whole section that you talk about with parents who serve alcohol or look the other way about alcohol or drugs because they think that's like the best decision, or that they're doing a good job by doing that. Can you speak?
I think they're actually afraid of their kids, right? They want connection with them, and they don't want their kids to be mad at them, right? Or to be, and they don't want they want their kids to be socially connected themselves. And so they want them to be liked, and they mistakenly believe that drug and alcohol abuse is going to help with that, right? The one that I hear all the time, I don't know, you can tell me which one you hear, but I hear, I don't want them to go off to college and not know how to handle their alcohol, right? Like, or I smoked pot all the time as a kid and I turned out fine, right? Like, so two different arguments. Like, first of all, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that kids do not need to practice drinking in order to become moderate drinkers. And in fact, when they drink, the earlier they start drinking, the more they drink in high school, the more they quote unquote practice drinking, the more likely it is that they will be alcoholics by the time they are 25. Right. So like people have a very serious substance use disorder is what it's called now. The marijuana thing I hear all the time too. Guess what? Marijuana, when we were in high school, had 2% THC, right? And really high CBD levels. CBD serves to reduce the high, kind of cancel out the high of the THC. Now the CBD has, for the most part, been bred out. It's a different species of plant that's commercialized, and the THC is pushing, it's over, so in many states, it's over 20%, right? So this is, I'm not saying it was okay, like for your brain as a teenager, if you smoked pot, like there are problems with the adolescent brain. The brain absorbs THC differently. It actually hinders brain development. So it's different for all teenagers, but believe me, it makes a huge difference the concentration of THC. It is not the same drug.
Yeah. Well, and I think even you address this too, that the longer kids can delay any kind of, if they're experimenting with things, the longer they delay, the better, because your brain, the plasticity and everything. I mean,
Yes.
Kids who are drinking when they're 15 years old,
right,
and continuing all the way through, like you said, are much more likely to end up with a lifelong problem. Whereas kids who wait till they're in their 20s, 20, 21, 22, legal, how about age, that is they tend to not have as many issues. I know, in my family, and it was, I never have served alcohol to anyone in my family under age 21. We follow the law here.
Yeah.
When my kids do become adults, I now have 3 who are adults. They can have a glass of wine if they'd like. We're not doing shots. We're not, we're not binge drinking.
Right.
They can have an adult type of, drink with me once they are legally of an adult. Before that, no way. Yeah. And like you said, I'll get junk food and candy and whatever. I'll, even though I don't like that stuff, I'll let them do that. But I would, that bothers me, parents who think that they're doing something good for kids by being the one serving alcohol. And, having been on the other end of one of my kids being in a circumstance where parents were making it seem appropriate and okay for underage kids to drink, I think it really counters what's best for kids. And it makes it so much easier for kids to access these things if parents are not providing the guidance they need.
Right. I also hear a lot of they're going to drink whether or not I provide it. So I'd rather that they be at home. And, I just don't think that that's our role as parents. I think our role as parents is to make it harder, right? You may be right. Your kid may be going to drink no matter what. But when you send this sort of message that I'd prefer if you didn't drink, but if you are going to drink, I want you to drink at home. That is not, I just think it's not the safe container that you want your home to be.
Mm-hmm. That just reminded me of a thing that I'm not sure I can even share on the podcast, but it basically in summary of it, after a very crazy couple of parties hosted by parents following a high school graduation, I hosted a group of kids who wanted a break.
Yeah.
They came to my home for what they called their cleanse/retreat.
Yeah.
And we did crafts and we, ate healthy, and they wanted that.
Right.
So they needed to come here to have a break from what was not available to them in their own homes.
Right. Yeah.
Which was really telling to me. I remember thinking it was funny because my child, who was the host, was like, yeah, everyone really just wants to be done with all this and just, we need a break.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, well, and so that is, again, even kids want, like you said, they want a place to go, and home is one of those great safe places where they know they're going to be taken care of, and there's going to be structure in place that creates this safety. I mean, that's what we've had to do at camp. We're very clear at camp on all the structure and guidelines, and we have adolescents, both our counselors who go, are all in their young 20s, and our teenage campers who come knowing what the rules are, knowing that drugs and alcohol are not part of the experience that they're coming to have. And they always are telling us what a great thing it is to have that break. And to not have that as part of the experience.
Yeah. I think that we sometimes forget that it doesn't actually feel good to them, right? They get into this, it feels much better to have an authentic connection, a sober connection with other human beings. And drugs and alcohol, obviously, they might make them feel at first like they can be more social, but it's not a really authentic connection. And so it's sad that they're losing, we grow up, and as adults, it's hard to not, I'm not a big drinker, obviously, but it's hard for me sometimes to be in different environments because we are such an alcohol-oriented culture. And so it's part of the great thing about childhood is that they can have these connections before they enter this world in which drugs and alcohol are at the center of a lot of our social stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just think I know from at least my kids and a lot of their friends, actually, I had a similar situation after graduation, that they appreciate it if you can help them have fun in ways that feel better to them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right.
And that leave your body feeling better too.
Right.
Like,
that's what I mean. Yeah. Right.
Feel better. Like you feel better. And when you were talking, I was just thinking about the counselors who've fallen in love at camp and ended up getting married. And because it was an environment where they were authentically connecting without, and I just love that aspect of camp, that these friendships are based on something a lot more solid and real than the ones that when you think about typically in like Greek life, like, oh, we're so bonded because we all like, shared this, whatever, keg or, and it's sad that a lot of even adults have not experienced the authentic connection that comes, that's not like lubricated with substances kind of thing. Right. It's like actual real human connection. So I love that. Well, of course, Christine, I could talk to you forever about this, but we need to wrap it up. So I will, I'll share links to anything, but if there was like one thing or that you just want to like take away parents to know, kind of a message of encouragement, what is it that you want to tell parents as we end this episode?
Well, certainly if you have a kid who's struggling, they're not alone, right? You're not alone in this whole thing. It's really hard for all of us. And there are a lot of resources out there. So like, you don't even have to go out and buy the book. There's a downloadable right on the homepage of my website, christinecarter.com, which is 7 tips for like helping kids deal with stress, helping a kid who's struggling. It will sort of summarize a lot of what we've talked about. So like, even if you just do one of those things, it's all research-based. It will help, right? Like we just have to engage, right? We just have to do our best. And once you have some more tools, you'll be able to do better, right? Like you'll see the quality of your relationship with your kids change.
Oh, I feel so encouraged. Thank you so much for being on, Christine. It's as always,
my pleasure.
It's so great talking with you. And we will definitely have to follow up again after the book's been out for a while, because I think there's so many more things in here that parents need to delve into more.
No, thank you. I look forward to it.
Thank you for listening to my chat with Dr. Christine Carter about her new book, The New Adolescence. I hope you'll pick up a copy for yourself, and I'd love to hear your feedback about what you learn from reading her book. I also really appreciate the mindset shift that she recommends of thinking about ourselves as our kids get older as being more of their coach than their manager. As always, you can find notes, links, and other resources related to today's conversation by visiting my website at sunshine-parenting.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for my email list so that you don't miss out on any of the great resources I have available for raising thriving kids. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate you sharing it with a friend. Please take a moment to give Sunshine Parenting a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Let's end with a quote from my book, Happy Campers. Positive relationships are what make a happy life. So let's help our kids build the social skills they need now to have strong friendships and positive relationships throughout their lives. I'm Audrey Monkey. Thank you for joining me for the Sunshine Parenting Podcast. Join me again next week.